promises from both sides.
And do you think the major parties have sufficiently addressed these issues of concerns?
Well, both parties are obviously trying to throw cash at voters. The government has spent quite a lot of money during its term in office offering rebates to people for, in particular, electricity bills. The first set of rebates they introduced in their first budget in October 2022 were targeted at low-income earners, pensioners, and people with social security cards, and they were reasonably generous, but subsequent rounds of electricity rebates have been completely untargeted. They've been made available indirectly through energy retailers rather than by payments to households themselves to reduce the electricity bills that people get from their retailers, irrespective of their incomes. And my view is that these sorts of things, though perfectly understandable when talking about people on low incomes for whom having electricity to cook, to heat, or if they live in hot climates to run the air conditioning is sort of absolutely essential to having a decent and dignified life. But for people who are better off than that, who might not like paying more for their electricity, but nonetheless can afford to do it without undue hardship, I think this is poor policy. It's poorly targeted. These things ought to be, I think, means or income tested, and they haven't been. Of course, the coalition's offerings aren't income tested or means tested either. The fuel excise rebate will predominantly benefit people who drive a lot and who drive relatively fuel inefficient vehicles like utilities and utes and SUVs and the like, big cars. Most of them live in outer suburbs of our big cities and in rural and regional areas where public transport is either scarce or not available at all. They're the areas that the coalition has been explicitly targeting to improve its position at this election, whereas people who walk or ride a bus or take public transport to work obviously won't get any benefit from that. And people who drive relatively short distances to work, who also typically live in inner city areas, won't get any benefit from that. And I guess the coalition isn't really looking to get many votes from people in that position. It's perhaps also worth noting that, in fact, global markets are now giving people relief from higher petrol prices because crude oil prices have come down from over $80 a barrel to about $65 a barrel while the election campaign has been in place. That's in large part because financial markets and commodity markets are anticipating that the US might go into recession as a result of the uncertainty created by all the policies that the Trump regime is seeking to institute in the US, and in particular, the rather chaotic way in which they are seeking to implement those policies. And given the fragility of many other economies around the world after the experience of tight monetary policy in the last 3 years, if the US goes into recession, many other economies, including potentially Australia, might do so as well. So in a sense, the fuel excise relief that the coalition is offering isn't as necessary as it might have seemed to be 3 months ago. Lamington, the one-off tax refund that is the other part of the coalition's cost of living measures, is not going to be paid until July next year. Now, the government is telling us through the Treasury, and the Reserve Bank is also telling us that by the middle of next year, the inflation rate's going to be back down to 2.5%, which is the midpoint of their target. That's in effect saying that cost of living pressures will have receded into relative insignificance. So you might ask, well, what's the point of offering cost of living relief when there isn't any more a cost of living crisis? But the coalition hasn't addressed that. When we turn to housing policies, which was the other thing that is a key focus of this campaign, while I acknowledge that both parties are offering measures that are intended to boost supply, Labor a bit more than the coalition, my criticism is that both parties are continuing to do things that needlessly inflate demand. Both parties' policies, the coalition's, I think, a bit more than the opposition's, will allow people to borrow more money than they would be able to in the absence of those policies. And while those policies may offer some assistance to those people who are able to arrange their affairs and the timing of their purchases to take advantage of those schemes, the net result of allowing people to borrow more money to spend on housing is that housing will become more expensive. And we have 60 years of experience going back to the first homeowners grant scheme introduced by the Menzies government in 1964, having promised it at the 1963 election. that anything that allows people to spend more on housing than they'd otherwise be able to do, whether it's first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions, mortgage deposit guarantee schemes, shared equity schemes, generous tax breaks for property investors, lower interest rates, or easier lending criteria on the part of banks and other lenders, anything that allows Australians to spend more on housing than they'd be able to otherwise results in more expensive housing and a smaller proportion of people owning that housing, that is, lower home ownership rates. And it's not a coincidence that Australia's home ownership rate peaked at the first census in 1966 after the introduction of the first homeowners grant scheme, and has been going down ever since to 66% at the most recent census in 2021. But that seemingly modest decline in Australia's overall home ownership rate over the last 58 years, from 72% in 1966 to 66% at the 2021 census, concealed some much bigger movements across different age groups. Among people who are aged 65 or over, the home ownership rate has scarcely changed in the last 6 decades. It's high, but the proportion of the population who are aged over 65 has more than doubled over that period as our population has aged. Among people under the age of 45, the home ownership rate at the 2021 census is back to where it was at the censuses of 1947 or 1954, the first ones conducted after World War II. And even among people aged between 45 and 54, who are not exactly young, the home ownership rate at the 2021 census was back to where it had, lower than where it had been at the census of 1961. So we've got overwhelming evidence that the kind of policies that the Coalition and Labor are offering at this election not only don't work, but actually make the problem worse. And you have to ask yourself, as I've been doing for decades, why do politicians keep doing things that not only don't solve the problem they're purported to be concerned about, but actually make it worse? And I can't avoid the conclusion that it's because, for all the crocodile tears they shed about the difficulties faced by aspiring young home buyers, the political reality that they know is that in any given year, there's only about 110,000 people who succeed in becoming first home buyers. And even if you assume that for every one of them who does, there's 5 or 6 who aren't able to, that's at most 750,000 votes for policies that would restrain the rate of house price inflation or stop it altogether. Whereas at any point in time, the politicians know there are at least 11 million Australians who own their own home. There are about 2.25 million who own at least one investment property. And the last thing that those maybe 12.5 million voters want is for governments to do anything that would slow the rate at which house prices keep going up. And so, on the one hand, 750,000 votes for policies that would slow the rate at which house prices keep going up, as opposed to maybe 12.5 million or more votes for policies that would keep house prices rising at a faster rate than the price of almost everything else. Even the dumbest of our politicians can, as the Americans say, do that math. And sadly, I think they do in the lead up to and during every election campaign, as we've seen during this one.
So aside from these issues that will win votes, are there any other important issues which have not been addressed in this campaign?
Well, yeah, I think there are.